This is episode 22 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Today's topic is one that I think most of us can relate to, and that is people-pleasing. This can show up in many ways. Saying yes to things when you mean no, not saying things because of how others might react, not saying how you really feel or asking for what you want, avoiding conflict. I thought people-pleasing was a meaningful topic to explore today, especially with the holidays around the corner. And I think that there are so many scenarios connected to the holidays where people-pleasing comes into play, especially with familial, societal, and cultural expectations. So without any further ado, let's get started with the interview. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, our guest is Sharon Martin. Sharon is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in San Jose, California. She's also a writer, speaker, and media contributor on emotional health and relationships. Her psychotherapy practice focuses on helping perfectionists and people pleasers embrace imperfection and learn to accept and love themselves. Sharon also writes a popular blog called Happily Imperfect for PsychCentral.com. Hi, Sharon, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
I have been following your work for a really long time, I would say at least a year, and I have just found what you've written on your blog and also in other places like Psych Central or the Good Man Project, just really helpful and meaningful for myself and also for my clients. So just thank you for all the meaningful and relevant information you've put out to the world.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's my goal, is to be able to share some of what I have learned over years of work as a psychotherapist and just, my own personal development and growth as a person as well, and trying to, combine those two. And, hopefully it resonates with, some of your listeners today as well. I have definitely found that the ideas of, struggling around sort of perfectionism and people pleasing and kind of not feeling good enough or like you're doing enough or doing it right, seem to be unfortunately pretty pervasive around, along the lines of, things that women struggle with. There's a number of things, but it seems like a lot of it kind of comes back to this sense that, maybe I'm not quite enough or doing it as well as somebody else. And, there's something sort of fundamentally wrong about me.
Yeah. I was thinking about this, this blog post you wrote for Psych Central. I think it was probably in the last few months, and it was about the 12 signs that you're being too nice. And and that really grabbed my attention because, as I look at myself and my own experiences and I sit with clients, I see this real struggle around if I say no, if I do this, or all these other choices that they're struggling with. There's this fear. And yes, the way that you described it, they are signs of being too nice. But you had a quote at the top of that post, which was, "The need to be liked and the fear of rejection shouldn't determine your reality." And I just thought that was so powerful. And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit more, Sharon.
Sure. I think ultimately, this idea that if we are nice and we're good and we do what, other people want us to do, that somehow that then means that we are, good enough and we are meeting people's expectations. They're going to be happy with us. And then that, sort of determines how we're going to feel about ourselves versus having, like almost some greater individuation, right? And seeing ourselves as truly independent, whole people that, yes, we're humans who, are very relational and we care about connection with other people, but that can't be the sole, thing that determines how we view ourselves or the value, that we feel like we bring, right? I mean, there
Yeah.
obviously is no way to make everybody happy all of the time. It's, clearly just simply, an impossibility. And I think sometimes we go about trying to, almost sort of please the wrong people.
Yeah.
Right, if you think about the people that you are closest to, I mean, those are the people whose opinions should matter the most, right? That,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
it's like I should care more about what my husband thinks than what the grocery store clerk thinks, right? Like that
Yes.
person I don't have a real strong relationship with. But sometimes, we go about as if these two things are equal and we care, about what everybody thinks all of the time and wanting them to be happy with us, so that we can then feel good about ourselves, like it's some kind of validation for us, versus really making some determination about, well, whose opinion really matters to me and why,
Yeah.
and what's going to happen if they're not happy with me,
Right.
should that matter? And if so, how do I handle it, if they are not happy with me? Because obviously even, people we're really close to, we may sometimes, they may be displeased with us too. And that can feel really, really awful, right? To
Right.
realize that, your loved one, is unhappy with something you did or didn't do or something you said. But, we're at least in a relational context there and, and trying to navigate how to handle that.
Yeah, I was listening to what you said and just laughing to myself because I was thinking about, because of course I struggle with this too.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about what you said about, the grocery store clerk or some other person who you have an interaction with, but yet, get caught up in just a concern about how they might be perceiving me or if I was rude or I shouldn't have reacted that way. And I just laughed because that just, I know that that's something that many of our listeners can relate to. And also, going back to this, the need to be liked and the fear of rejection, it made me think about this quote that my mentor, James Hollis, who's a Jungian analyst, had shared. And I'm going to paraphrase it, so not say it as eloquently. But basically, he said that, the majority of people who are in a therapist's office and in general moving through the world, we're motivated by fear, and that the fear goes down to two areas. And one of those fears is the fear of abandonment, or it's also rejection, or with the withdrawal of approval, or the loss of someone's love.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the other fear is being overwhelmed by feelings, our own or what we think how the other will respond or how they actually do respond. So maybe, we're motivated by our own fear of, feeling guilty because we said no, so we want to avoid that, or the fear of someone else's disappointment, which is also, the fear of, a loss of someone's approval. So that just came to mind as you were describing, as you were going into more depth about that quote.
Yeah, I really like that because, I liked that part too that you were talking about, the overwhelming feelings as a sort of an interesting component to this. Because I think a lot of people, do get overwhelmed by their feelings, right? Like that's again, like just a really common thing that we're often trying to, feel like we can control our feelings and, trying to keep them at a manageable level, right? Nobody wants to sort of feel like their anger is out of control or their
Yeah.
fear is out of control and then they don't know how to handle that. Right. So I think that's sort of a pretty common, dynamic that people have is like, let me just kind of numb this down and try to keep it at a smaller level. I don't want to feel too much.
Yeah.
But then I think, maybe related to that is that sometimes we get so out of touch with our own feelings that then we're putting this overemphasis on other people's feelings, right? It can
Right.
sometimes be, well, I want to sort of control other people's feelings
Yes. Yeah.
about me or about other things, right? And so if I can be, perfect and I can do just what they want, I can control the way that they feel about me, right? And I can, essentially sort of make them like me or be pleased with me. And then I can eliminate some of the overwhelming feelings that I might have too if they're displeased with me. I mean, I hope that makes sense. I know it feels a little
Yeah.
confusing to me as I say it, but I think part of, this whole issue around people pleasing and perfectionism is that there's really almost sort of a loss of a strong sense of self, right? That there's too much emphasis put on, what do other people think versus what do I actually think and feel and believe. And some of those things kind of get lost along the way, as we're trying to make everybody else happy, right? Sometimes that
Right.
means we're compromising ourselves.
Yeah. That so resonates because when I think of, you know, myself and clients who I've worked with, often seeing how that focus on externals is so out of balance and really can kind of cloud their own clarity as to what's going on within, and not just cloud things, but help to avoid that aspect too. I like how you mentioned that there is a piece of, controlling behavior in here, and I think that's sometimes hard to own up to or say, yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's happening with me. But you really, I think, captured that when you said, the desire to try to control how others might perceive us, or how we think, how we would like to be related to.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, I think you are absolutely right that there definitely is an element of controlling that happens here, especially if we expand this a little bit, along the lines of perfectionism. I think we start to see even more sort of in the behavioral side of things that you're right. I mean, it is often very hard to sort of accept that about ourselves. And I
Yeah.
know it's hard for me. And I have had clients, as they sort of realize it, kind of go, oh, but I don't want to be controlling, but that really is part of what's going on, is when you need things to be in very particular ways in order for you to feel okay. That means you do try to make other people conform,
Right.
to the way that you think things should be.
Yeah.
Right. And we all know it's somewhat illogical that it does not really matter, the way the dishes are put into the dishwasher. And yet I find myself constantly rearranging them so that they are the way that I think they will fit best and be washed best.
Yeah.
Right. And I realize it's a total waste of time.
Right.
And, it is an element of, right, trying to control something outside of myself in an attempt to control the internal part of me, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Like almost
right, because it's. I think there's an anxiety component that starts to show up, right? Anytime you start to feel like, oh, this feels really out of control. It's like I want it. I don't want to feel out of control. I want to feel in control, right? And so if
right.
I can line things up in this particular way, then I feel like, oh, I've got some sense of control, even though, of course, probably a lot of the important things still remain outside of your control.
Yeah, so in a way, you could say that some aspects of perfectionism and people pleasing are an attempt at managing anxiety.
I think for a lot of people that there is some underlying anxiety. I would say it's the underlying anxiety as well as some issues around maybe we'd call it self-esteem or self-worth, or just a sense of self, right, and not feeling like that's really strongly developed for people, and that therefore I think they're sort of vulnerable to sort of being pushed in the direction that other people want to push them, right? They're sort of susceptible to, somebody says, oh, well, you should vote for this person, and that person, oh yes, well, I will do that because you think it's the right thing to do, and I don't have a strong opinion of my own.
So, Sharon, what would you say are some of the ways that someone could begin to strengthen the self-worth part of this, so that the other aspects of this, the perfectionism, the people pleasing, the anxiety, so that can start to be experienced differently?
Yeah, I think the first part is to really go back to trying to get in touch with who you are. I find a lot of women have sort of lost touch with, what is it that you like to do? What are the things that you enjoy? Who are the people you enjoy? your hobbies, your interests, your beliefs, what really matters? What are your values? And trying to take a look at, how are those things currently fitting into your life, or how could they, right? Sometimes people recognize that the way they're living their life is really not in line with the things that are the most important to them. Or I think sometimes people will find that they are spending all their time, in roles or activities that don't bring them a lot of, joy or, sort of fill them up. And so kind of going back to some of those real basic things about, who am I and, what matters to me, and trying to bring some of those things into your life to strengthen, well, this is who I am, and these are the things that I like to do, and really trying to recognize that it's okay for us all to like different things, right? And really trying to see that there is, a strength here. Of course, there's the very basic idea that, of course, life would be very boring if we all were the same and all liked the same thing and all did the same things. That there's really is an enrichment that comes to our life by being different. But I think it's also having some experiences where you can test the waters, and not do everything the way that both the way that you maybe think that they should be done, or the way that other people think they should be done. Sort of like getting outside of this rigidness about, who you are and how you should behave, and trying some different things and seeing how it feels. But of course, recognizing that initially that may feel uncomfortable. It probably will, but that with practice and sort of broadening yourself, you start to have some new experiences that might be enjoyable in some different ways. I think sometimes you don't even realize kind of what you're missing out on because you don't know what it is.
And I think too, Sharon, along with what you're saying about really getting to know yourself on a deeper level and finding out what really matters to you and who you are, apart from your roles. I think that this is also, while it's an experience that can be very positive for an individual, I think sometimes it's also really difficult and scary when they begin to evaluate maybe how their life is not lining up with what really matters to them, and also what it will take to make those shifts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, change is difficult across the board. And I think most people recognize that making any significant change in their life is going to be a struggle, and it's going to be work. It doesn't just come easily and, joyfully at the beginning. But I think, when you think about, you have to be experiencing some discomfort, I think, in order to be able to say, okay, well, let me wrestle with this for a little bit, with the idea that I can come out on the other side of it and, be happier and stronger and healthier, and have relationships that are more meaningful, and really sort of be more of who I am. I wouldn't want to give anybody the false sense that, you can just do this in a weekend or something,
Right.
go take a art class or something and you'll have discovered who you are. But, it's in a lot of ways, it's very much a lifelong process that, as we continue to grow and change and develop as people, hopefully we, bit by bit discover more and more of who our true selves are, right? And again, I mean, it's almost just sort of that cliche that it is about the journey and not the destination, that we're never going to get to a finish line of, oh, now I'm me, I'm totally who I am, because I'm always changing.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a process, and I think that it's interesting to see how beneath the perfectionism, the people-pleasing behaviors, the self-worth challenges, that if you can work through that, you really can get to a place where you're living your life more authentically. Because I think that's something that gets sacrificed in the process of trying to make sure that everyone else feels good, everyone else is happy. Unfortunately, by doing that, you give up parts of who you are.
Well, and I think you just hit on something that's really important, in this conversation, because what I have also found is that while it feels good to please other people, it's almost kind of shallow, in the sense that when it's sort of this false self that is doing all of the right things, that positive feedback only means so much, because I have this feeling of, but you don't really know the real me. And so if you really did, you would still be displeased with me. And I still have some underlying fear that you're not going to accept me, love me, and stick around. Right? So it's
Yeah.
actually only when the true self can really be present there that you can actually feel really secure and connected with people. Right? Otherwise, we're just on this very, surface level. Yes, you're happy with me, but it's not really me completely that you
Yeah.
know.
I love how you said that, Sharon, because what I see often with clients is that, for example, like in a relationship, the longer they go with making sure the other person is happy and they're pleasing them and everything is harmonious, the harder and harder it gets for them to show up authentically, because what happens when they do is they may get a response like, why are you acting like this? You've never said this before. This never bothered you. And then
Mm-hmm.
that immediately, causes them to shut down, to feel like, they don't have the right to say or feel whatever that they're feeling. And then it
Mm-hmm.
just really pushes who they are further back and makes it even more difficult for the real parts of themselves to kind of show up.
You're right, because right when you've been really, keeping that shut down and, not letting that real self come out, people, are almost, maybe a little shocked at times to say, oh, you think that? You never gave any indication that you disagreed with me about that,
Yeah.
and all along, you've been like feeling like, I don't agree, but you
Yeah.
haven't felt like you say it.
Yeah.
Um,
So Sharon, maybe you could speak a little bit about, because I know that this is an area that is your focal point, your specialty, but this is a big question. So maybe you can break it down for me. I was going to ask you if you could talk a little bit about how perfectionism and people pleasing and self-worth are all connected. And I know there's other pieces you can pull in, but how do all these three things intersect? How do they all intersect?
Sure. Well, and I think we touched on a little bit already. So,
Yeah.
I would say that you've kind of got at the core of this a sense of not feeling like you are good enough and worthy enough, and like there's something that is wrong with you. And so because of that, the way to get people to like you and want to be around you is to mold yourself in the way that they would like you to be. So you've kind of got that, chameleon, aspect of you. And the reason that you do that is because, you have that fear that they will discover that there is something wrong with you. And once they know that, they aren't going to be, accepting, and they don't want to ultimately be with you. And so, people may, in addition to that, just have some anxiety, right? Anxiety is just, it's very common, right? So many people struggle with anxiety in one form or another. But what I often see is that when people try to move away from people pleasing and perfectionism, is that there is a big spike in anxiety, right? As we were talking about, sort of the fear that is part of people pleasing and perfectionism is that we become extra sensitive to the criticism and the notion that people are going to reject us or leave us. And so once you start to, have this stronger sense of self, I mean, that feels good in some ways, but it also feels really difficult in some ways, because you're going to get some resistance, from other people, right? If you start to assert yourself or, create some boundaries that other people aren't used to, the natural thing from them is that they're going to have some resistance to that. As you were saying earlier, they're going to say, well, what is this all about? You've never said this, or you've never done this, or why do you now, tell me that this isn't okay? Right. So you end up having people who are at least initially unhappy or maybe even just confused about, the new behavior or the sort of,
Right.
some of the aspects that you're showing of yourself. And so when you feel real anxious about that, there's kind of this natural tendency to slide back and say, well, let me just go back to being a perfectionist and getting approval that way, and being a people pleaser and getting approval that way. And then I don't feel anxious about how people feel about me, and I don't feel as fearful. I mean, it doesn't actually solve the problem because it may temporarily decrease your anxiety, but you still end up with the problem that we were talking about earlier, which is, you really don't know who you are, or you don't feel safe to let that person, be seen in the world, right? So you're always living this very small little life in a small
Yeah.
little world that's like, there's so much more out there, and maybe so much more that you could or would like to be able to do if you would allow yourself to take those chances. But recognizing that taking those chances mean not everybody is going to give you that approval, right? And some of that has to be replaced by, the internal approval, which is, I like myself, I'm
Yeah.
happy with what I'm doing, and therefore it matters less. It's not ever going to not matter at all, but it will not be as hurtful or feel that important when, people, especially people that you're not as close to, don't give you all of the positive feedback anymore.
Yeah. I was thinking about, when you said that, when you made the comment about replacing the external approval with the internal approval, and how that shift is a big part of this moving to a different way of relating in a way that is more authentic.
Well, I think that, it's only normal that we all want approval. Let's be
Yes,
honest, right?
yes, right.
Like, who doesn't want, somebody to say good job, or I love you, or, in some way let you know that you are important, or they like you, or what you have done, right? We all crave that positive feedback.
Right.
It's just sort of a matter of degrees, and recognizing that you can't always get it, even if you are doing, sort of quote unquote, the right thing or an excellent job, like a lot of times people will have an experience where they're doing a great job at work, but they have a boss who just never gives any positive feedback, right? Like, if you can imagine somebody who got, a great performance review, and so they know that they're doing well, but the boss's personality is just such that they never come and say, great job. There's no bonus. There's no pat on the back. There's no, any of that kind of stuff that would feel good and that a lot of us want. So we need to be able to give it to ourselves as well, and say, well, I know that I'm doing a good job. I know I'm putting in 100%. I can see that there are results that are happening here. And so, whether or not I get, my boss to come over and tell me this, I can't just go through my life, feeling really awful because, nobody's giving me positive feedback, right? There has to be some internal, measure too, where that we can give ourselves, positive validation and, positive
Yeah.
feedback and, positive self-talk, all that kind of good stuff really needs to matter, I would say, more than anything you're going to get from anybody else. Again, it's that kind of that idea that, the relationship with yourself is the most important relationship because you're the one who is always there. Other
Absolutely.
people
Yeah.
in your life are going to come and go. And we need to be able to take care of ourselves, emotionally, as well as physically and all other aspects, right? I think sometimes we forget that, we are the ones who need to be able to soothe our emotions and, give us sort of the positive good stuff as well.
Yeah, and I think, what you just shared, Sharon, really ties into a theme that has really been woven through a few of our podcast episodes, and that the relationship that you have with yourself is key. It's so important for coping with things, that happen, for feeling that groundedness and centeredness when you're making decisions or moving through life in a way that others may, have opinions
Mm-hmm.
about that are that are hard for you to hear or experience. So I like that you mentioned that again, going back to you are the common denominator in all your experiences.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then I think, how are you going to be able to have a positive relationship with yourself and ultimately like love yourself if you don't even know who you are?
Yeah.
That's where I kind of come back to. It's like, you have to get in touch with who you are and what you're about so that, you know what it is that you're loving and what it
Yeah.
is you're accepting, right? It's like
Right.
you have to be able to sort of turn inward and look at all of these different aspects of yourself and accept the parts that maybe you don't think are the best, right? The
Yeah.
imperfections, the ideas that maybe aren't so popular but you actually like those things, and looking at the entire picture here instead of just some little pieces.
Sharon, how do you think perfectionism, people pleasing, self worth, codependency, all of these pieces of this experience, how are they different for women if there are differences?
Well, I will say one, I don't know if it's a difference, but I do think women tend to struggle with these issues more than men. And now, I don't mean to say that men don't, because I certainly have plenty of male clients that show up, dealing with these things as well. But I do think there is something, about the way that women are raised, that sort of makes these issues a little bit more prevalent. Like we were talking about at the beginning, just the idea that, you should be nice
Right.
and you should make people happy and you should take care of other people's needs and pay
Mm-hmm.
attention to how other people are feeling. Those things, on one extreme really don't support a strong sense of self necessarily, right? And they don't
Right.
necessarily value the individual woman or girl. So I do think, that women, are more likely to kind of have some of those struggles, and I think related to that, women really are very relational. Again, I don't mean to say that men aren't, but, women really crave, deep connection, I think, not just with their partners, but with other women, as friends. And again, I think maybe we fear, the being outcast and the
Yeah.
being, not part of the group and being different in some different ways, or maybe, the hurt around some of those criticisms or rejections, can be really deep for women. I don't know. That's just my thought.
Yeah.
Obviously not being a man, I don't know. I think, there are plenty of, very sensitive men who, feel these things very deeply
Of course. Yeah.
as well. But I do think, sort of the way that relationships are formed and, and maintained, it is different between men and women often. And I think there's a piece of that may come into play here as well.
So Sharon, if we have a listener who is really connecting with this conversation, and this is an area she struggles with, what would be your words of wisdom for her to maybe begin to shift her experience?
I think I would say, really just something very, very simple along the lines of, you are worth it. You are worth putting in the effort and the time, and that there is really, truly something special and wonderful about every single person on this planet. And, it's like I feel like you sort of to yourself and to everybody else to let that person come out and be known. I think people think maybe they're doing everybody a favor by staying hidden, in some way. And I think it's really the opposite, that there is something great and wonderful in different ways about everybody. And that once you really connect with people in that true way, I think you will find, this level of connection that is so much more meaningful, that it outweighs, the scary parts about being known as well.
Sharon, what are some of your favorite resources, books, or websites on these areas that we've been talking about today?
There's a lot of different books out there. I would say, I time and time again, keep coming back to Brene Brown's work. All of her book is just fantastic. And another favorite of mine is Kristen Neff's book, Self-Compassion. And her website is fantastic as well. She's got a lot of free resources on there along the lines of how you can, have compassion, love yourself, give yourself, some kindness. And like I was saying, some of this sort of just emotional, good stuff that you can support yourself with. So those I think are great resources for women.
And I'm going to add that I feel that your website and blog is also an excellent resource for women. And I guess this is a good segue into my next question, which is, can you share the best way that people can get in touch with you and find out more about, your upcoming projects or offerings that they can maybe take advantage of?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. So I write Happily Imperfect on Psych Central, and I write 2 posts a week on there, so there's lots of content there. And then I have a newsletter that I put out usually just once a month, so it's not a huge volume of email that people are going to get from me. And usually there's a link to sign up for the newsletter at the end of all of my blog posts. So if you go and read a blog post from there, you can sign up for the newsletter. And that's probably the best way, to keep up to date on all of the new things that I might be doing. And then I have the website for my counseling practice, which is SharonMartinCounseling.com. And I have another blog there as well. So that's a great place to go as well to do some reading. I've got a resource page there and, various other updates. So those are the best places to find me.
Sharon, thank you so much for your time today and sharing all of your insights with our listeners. I just want you to know, too, I didn't mention this before, but I have been a fan of yours for such a long time, even when I heard you, I think it was maybe over a year ago on Selling the Couch. And so I am really honored and moved that you took the time to talk with me today and to just share your insights with our listeners.
Well, I appreciate that. Of course, as we were talking about, I too enjoy having positive feedback. But I will also say it's very much been, part of my own journey. And as I'm sure you're experiencing with your podcast, the more you sort of put yourself out there in the world. So I really appreciate that, Lourdes. I, like everybody else, enjoy getting positive feedback. I'm the same as everybody else in that regard, but it's very much also been this process for me of, doing more writing and doing more podcasts and sort of being, out in the world more with my work. And I imagine that you have had a similar experience with your podcast, is that the more that you let yourself be seen in the world, you recognize that some people are loving what you're doing and other people are not going to love what you're doing. And sometimes they let you know that. They do. Sometimes I get some not so nice comments on my blog posts.
Yeah.
And that's something that I learn as I go too, that it is okay for some people to disagree. I mean, it is ultimately exactly, what my goal is for we can all have our own opinions and we can all be ourselves and we can agree to disagree at times. And I can ultimately know that I feel proud of what I'm doing and I can, feel good about the work that I am doing and putting out there into the world. And if not everybody likes it, that is okay. That doesn't determine how I feel about myself, right?
Right. A wonderful way to wrap up a conversation about people-pleasing and perfectionism. Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate your time.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I hope today's conversation was meaningful for you. For me, what stood out is how controlling behaviors are connected to people-pleasing and perfectionism. How changing people-pleasing behaviors requires a certain degree of discomfort, and often this shows up in the shape of anxiety. And when people begin to experience the anxiety that comes with this change, it can often push them back into the people-pleasing behaviors. Finally, if you want to shift from people-pleasing and perfectionistic behaviors, there's a need for you to really know who you are and what matters most to you, so that you can make intentional choices aligned with your authentic self. If you are interested in learning more about what matters to you, on my website you can sign up for a life alignment exercise that will walk you through a few steps that will support you in gaining clarity on your values, where these values come from, and how your life today reflects what matters most to you. For show notes to today's session and for the links to all the resources mentioned, visit www.lourdesviado.com/women in depth. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.